Hi, everybody. I'm back again, and I am going to be reading the last of the story. For those of you who are just tuning in, um, I'm currently reading my dad's manuscripts so that I can mark them up for editing. Except this time, I just what I have to read this month, and yeah, finding out after the fact that it's not finished and not even close to finished. So there's that. Ugh. Um, as a result, what I'm going to be doing is finishing up tonight, and then I'm going to go in and it'll be a little while. I thought I was going to be doing something on Friday, but I think I'm just gonna leave it at that. So once I'm done reading tonight, I'm going to go over when I think I'm going to be back online. At this point, I'm not really sure. I have to try and determine what the next project's going to be. Um, I'll possibly do like a little mini stream to kind of let people know what's going on. And post where I can to kind of give like a little bit of an update. But it's just there's a lot, especially with I burnt myself out already at the beginning of the year. So now I'm working my way back, which was a bad thing because now I'm like way behind on all my projects that I'm trying to get done this year, which projects mostly mean publishing novels. Um, yes, multiple novels. Feel free to look up J.P. Wagner for more stories. And yeah, go back to back episodes. You can listen to previous stories that I've read. And I'll be releasing on Twitch anyway. I'll be releasing all of those as past broadcasts, so they're going to be stuck up there for a while. I'm not really sure, like for a determinate amount of time anyway. And yeah, so that people can go back and to listen to previous stories. Yeah. So instead of me umming and ahhing, how about I finish reading the story? I'm currently last part of For 40 Silver Ponies. And then I'll do a reflection once I'm done. So without further ado, we are now on chapter 10. Chapter 10, Chakath. Nalistador looked up from his work. We have a lot of choices right now, Chakath, but our choices are going to get less and less as time goes on. Right now, I've got plenty of power and equipment, so I could, if we want, make a set of warnings tailored exclusively to goblins. After a few days, I'd be down to broad warnings of anything vaguely man-sized, and eventually it would be warning of anything. And that's when it starts being less useful, since we'd get mice, rats, and large insects tripping it, and nobody get any sleep. And another thing, after I've kept these traps around us for so many nights, when it comes down to fighting, I won't be much good. You're the one in charge, Shakath, so you be the one to decide just what you'd want here. Shakath considered. We'll want to watch ourselves for about 5 days. Do I understand correctly that it's easier on you to do the broad trap, torn about anything man-sized? The mage nodded. That's about it. Right. Said it that way then. He looked around at the others. You all know this, but I'll say it anyway, just to make myself feel better. Just because we have a magic watching out camp doesn't mean that whoever's on watch can slack off and doze. You know that goblins will occasionally have a shaman with them, and some of those shaman are fairly accomplished magicians who may well get past our magic. So keep your eyes open. Oh, yes, indeed, for certain, great chief. Jakath gave the half-elf a sideways glance. Play the fool all you like, laughed O'Kisson, just so you stay wide awake when you're on watch. But in the end, the goblins didn't attack at night. Instead, a few days later up the trail, Late in the afternoon, they came howling out of the brush beside the trail. The party was not quite caught unawares, for Lofto Kissing just said to them, "I got a feeling about this place," when they heard the first rustling of the brush. The half elf had his bow up and bent before the first goblin war cry sounded, and the rest of the party had weapons readied. Nalus Tador sent some kind of fire blast from his fingertips that downed a goblin just behind one that caught Lofto Kissen's arrow. And then it was a matter of close quarters. Analysts, Jakath and Orphaz, had their weapons out and were fighting fiercely, while Lofto Kissen spent a moment looking for an opening for another arrow, then his barrel bow and his own. There had been only 5 of the goblins, so that with the lack of the 2 that had gone down to the arrow and magic bolt, they were outnumbered. They were a little slow to realize this, however, and it wasn't until Jakath killed one and the other 2 were wounded that they fled for the bush. Orphaz would have pursued them, but Jakath caught him by the arm and held him back. "They're gone, Orphaz. No sense pushing them. If you corner them, they'll have to fight. We don't need to lose anyone for what a goblin might carry." He looked around at the others. "All of you, check yourselves for wounds, even scratches. Sometimes goblins poison their blades. Even if it doesn't kill you, it can make you sick." Analyst had a small slash on the forearm. Lofto Kissen had a slight scratch on the shoulder, and that was the total of the wounds suffered. They washed the wounds thoroughly and searched the goblin bodies for anything of value. They tossed aside the goblin weapons. "If we were nearer a city," Jakath told analysts, "it might be worth taking them along to sell to someone as souvenirs. But as it is, it's not worth the trouble." None of the goblin ornaments were anything but glass beads, and their pouches yield only a total of 5 copper pieces. "Too little to share out," Jakath ruled. "Put it into the common fund. We can use it to buy supplies." Orphaz looked up. "Jakath, usually I wouldn't start making complaints about the way a leader leads, but maybe next time you could arrange for us to be ambushed by slightly richer goblins?" Jakath snorted. "And I suppose you'd want to be armed with nothing more than wooden clubs, too?" Nalus Tedor suggested they be armed with nothing more than crutches, and various people suggested less and less likely possibilities while they gathered up their equipment to set to marching once more. Jakath was interested to see that even analysts tossed in something about having them be dressed only in ragged undershirts. Later that evening, around the campfire, they discussed the day's events. Consensus was that just because one band of goblins had attacked them, they ought not to relax their vigilance for a while, since there might be more than one band of goblins wandering the wilds. Then Orc looked at Alice and said, "You handled yourself fairly well there, Alice." "I told you," Jakath broke in. "I vouched for his ability for you all, if you remember." Lofto-Kissin nodded. "So you said, Jakath, and so you did indeed. But it's always a little better to be able to see the evidence with your own eyes before you walk into a really desperate situation." Jakath, sorry, Nadas Tador only nodded. Analyst seemed to be unsure as to whether any response was called for on his part, but he finally spoke up. "My uncle thought that a man, even a scribe, ought to keep himself physically fit, and he thought that learning the sword was a good way as any. It's good to know that the lessons weren't entirely wasted." The, the day finally came when they reached the border of Lilani and Ellis. The town seemed a little seemed a strange mixture of peoples: Shondokranian, Eridarians, numerous half-breeds, and some whose races couldn't be quite distinguished. There were a large number of men around in various sorts of armor, though the general fashion seemed to be to wear the typical Shondokranian spike-topped helm with whatever armor one might have. Most of the local women, even those not of Shondokranian descent, went about clothed and hooded, some with even faces veiled so heavily that only the dark eyes showed. The party stayed the night at one of the inns, and during the evening, Jakath began to explain to Annalise some of the facts about Shandakar. In Shandakar, if you've got the right money for the right bribes, you can get anything. In fact, there were great risks in going into Shandakar without a store of bribed money. If it comes down to a matter between a Chandakranian and a foreigner, the foreigner is always in the wrong. Now, you know as well as the rest of us just how much money we have, and that means we have to keep our heads down and try not to be noticed. So you always keep your wits about you. If you have an urge for a cup of ale, remember that nobody is going to be able to pull you out of any trouble you cause. In fact, if we see you heading for trouble, we're most likely we're most likely to leave fast and try hard to convince people we don't know you. All right? The boy looked a little truculent, but he seemed to understand that he had given them some cause to be wary of his good sense while he was drinking. He nodded quietly and sat back to watch the scene around them. Your best bet is to try not to get separated from the rest of us. Most of us have a little of the language. And if some noble or petty noble says something to you, one of us can give him some kind of answer. If you don't understand what he says to you, he might consider it some sort of insolence. And the least you'd be, because I want you to understand what kind of situation we could get into without even knowing it. All right? All right. I'll try not to get us into trouble. There was still a little truculence in his expression, but Jakath felt fairly certain that he'd convinced Annalise about how risky a proposition they were on. It was several days' march westward, where they crossed the border to the land of Pihar Ebrar. They marched carefully, leaving the road wherever they saw large mounted parties ahead, and in general avoiding crowds. On occasion, they would go into some small settlement or other to replenish needed supplies, but they were always camped out in the hills in the countryside. One of these brief expeditions into town, they encountered another party of adventurers. It was Helka's band, and Jakath smiled inwardly to see the sort of look Annalise put on when he saw the girl, Beldar. He turned to Annalise and whispered quickly, "Be careful what you say. It's fine to be friendly to other adventurers, but don't let them know where we're going. If they have somewhere to go, let them go there. There's no sense tempting them with our treasure." Alice nodded, and Jakath hoped he'd really heard what had been said to him, for his attention was so strictly focused on the girl. They invited themselves to sit with Helkas and his group, nor were they totally with people of Aradar than the citizens of the border or the people of Shandakar. The conversation started a little limply, as each side tried to find something to talk about that would not lead to the revelation as to what they were doing here. Jakath started off. "This reminds me of the time I was with Galdeth. When we fought goblins just across the border from here. The goblins have been increasing, and the local authorities were offering a bounty on them, along with whatever loot we could pick up off the bodies. There were so many of them that we were putting them together we were putting together 2 or 3 bands to go hunting. The only trouble was that we got a bit of money here and there, a bit there, and we're always spending a little at a time, so we never got rich. Not too many goblins around these days, either side of the border, commented Helcus. I wasn't around for that one, but I did hear about it. I was out with Durras's band, hunting out an ogre in the mountain of Kilnessair. We got him, too, and a fairly healthy haul from his cave, but the trouble was that we were so battered up from the fight that we spent most of the money on healing and on new equipment. I don't like ogres, said Jessica. And that's the reason. Too much trouble for what you can. I remember fighting one way off in Hafenar. Hafenar. There were 6 of us, and when the fight was over, 3 were dead. The rest were badly battered. And what we found in its lair, like you said, was just enough to pay for our healing, with little or nothing left over. The conversation went on like this for a little while on both sides. Sorry, for a little while, until both sides realized the other wasn't likely to slip any useful information about what they were presently engaged in. From there, the conversation went on to various people known to the various members. A number of these had died in various ways, ranging from rather nasty to foolish. One or two had hit upon a rich venture that was everyone's dream and had retired. Some, even after becoming well off, continued to go forth venturing, though no one could just say why. Jacath was pleased to see Annalise nursing one mug of ale for most of the evening. One thing that worried him a little was the way the boy kept looking at the girl when he thought she wasn't watching. If he managed to be alone with her for any length of time, Trent and Vera know what he might let slip. But the girl kept a stern expression on her own face, seldom smiling or laughing, which seemed to keep Annalise in check. Despite all that, they got through the evening without incident. Jacath managed to get the band up in the morning and on the trail before any of Helcus's crew were up and about, and Annalise seemed a little irritable about getting up so early. There's no real way to hide the fact we're headed into Shandakar, Jacath explained, with a little more patience than he felt. The best we can do is to get enough of a start so that they don't think it's worthwhile to try and follow us. For the first few days in Shandakar, Annalise was rather pale and nervous, particularly when they met any group of armed men. After that, he began to settle down a bit, and Orphaz started teaching him a few words of the language. As for Orphaz himself, he seldom smiled they were in during the time they were in Shandakar, and at times when they encountered anyone who seemed to make any pretensi- pretensions at all to nobility. He maintained a very carefully blank expression on his face. It was about a week's march into Pihar Obrar, and they did not stop in the city at all. We have problems enough in the countryside, Jacath said. Going into the city itself is asking for trouble. The next difficulty was to find the precise location of the treasure, based on the description by the old man in the tavern. First off, Jacath said, we look around for the kind of country ogres prefer. That'll narrow it down for us a bit. If it comes to that, we can ask the locals if they've ever had any trouble with ogres. They found the cave without the necessity of having to ask anyone anything. Even after all this time, there is still a sour stench to it, which identified it as having been the home of an ogre. There were no tracks visible, which squared well with the notion that this had been, but no longer, was the home of an ogre. All the same, they entered carefully. After all, another ogre might have taken up residence there. Taken residence there too recently to have left visible traces. Visible. Oh my goodness. They carefully slipped inside, looked around as best they could, satisfied themselves that the ogre was not presently there, then lit torches. There had been some things there, that was clear. but it seemed also clear that just about anything of value had been removed. There were a couple of scraps of broken jewelry, a few rusted swords, two broken helms, and some smashed pottery. Jakath's heart sank. By Tren and Viren, someone's beat us to it. It would seem so, said Lafado, Lefto, Kissin, calmly. Or perhaps the old fellow who told you about it overestimated what they'd left behind. Jakath nodded. That's always possible. Well, let's find a place to camp that's a little out of the stink and decide what to do next. I'll agree to that much at least, said Nihilus Tedor. But we're going to have to find something fairly soon. Our funds are starting to run a bit low. As they moved outside, Orphaz smiled wryly. I guess we ought to have taken those goblin swords and sold them while we had the chance. As a joke, it was not particularly successful. No one even smiled. The discussion about their next step was fairly short. Well, Chandakar. I suppose the real question is, where do we go from there? Nanos's head came up suddenly. We're not just going to go back to Ithansor. Well, we might do that, but we have to have something to live on first. At the very least, we might try to get some work as guards for a merchant caravan. What we're discussing here is what direction we'll take once we get back across the border. I suggest we work our way northward along the main road to see what we can pick up. Lafado Kissin shrugged. As good an idea as any. I'll go along, said Nihilus Tedor. So will I, said Orphaz. There was a silence. Then Annalise realized everyone was waiting for him to say something. Oh, you can count on me too. Chapter 11. Annalise. Annalise spent the time marching out of Shandakar, moving back and forth between depression and moderate elation. Depression because the treasure they had sought was gone. Elation because the weather was fine and the others seemed to take it for granted that they would find something somewhere. When they finally left Chandakar, he felt that he could breathe a little easier without the constant fear of falling afoul of some noble or petty noble. Excuse me. By this time, he knew enough Chandakranian to be able to ask for food or drink and fumble with directions to the next town. But he was not at all confident. Then, of course, he was back in his own land, speaking his own language. He consoled himself that he would be more ready the next time they went into Chandakar. Suddenly he realized he was already thinking of the next time, and he grinned to himself. No, no, he thought to himself. I'm not a venturer. All I want is 40 silver ponies, and then I go home. Then suddenly there came into his mind a picture of the girl, Veldar. So cool and aloof. No, she would have no townsman, nor any boy who hadn't been a adventurer long enough to warrant it the title. And did he think just to take his 40 silver pennies, his 40 silver ponies, and settle down at Lanathan's house and hope for something good to fall in his lap? He marched along in a morose frame of mind for some time. Lapto Kissin suddenly said to him, Why look so grim, boy? Chances are we'll run into her a little further down the road. He swung his head around sharply, planning to make some sort of retort, but at the last moment he decided not to bother. It was his private problem, and no one here had the right to know about it. But on the other hand, he had to work with these people, and that work might involve guarding each other's backs, so best not to have any hard feelings. But the half-elf continued. If you wonder how I know, It's written all over your face. I have nothing against young love or young lovers, but just make sure it doesn't slow your reaction if we run into trouble. No, I won't slow down, laughed O'Kissin. Depend on it. Stop aggravating the boy, growled Orphaz. You've given him a warning, now leave it at that. For some reason, being called a boy irritated Analyst more than any of the things that had been said. But once again, he held his temper in check, even as the half elf answered back to Orphaz. Finally, Jakath, at the front of the column, shouted back to them. Save your arguments for the campfire tonight, and all of you keep your wits about you. The others subsided, and Analyst found himself involved in working out just what comments he ought to have made to both Lafto Kissin and to Orphaz. They came at last to a town called Intellis, where they stayed the night. Once again, they avoided the inn, knowing that they could hardly afford to buy necessities, let alone pay for a room and board. That evening, as they were sitting around their campfire, there was a sound. Weeks in the wild had sharpened their senses, so they immediately came alert, gripping weapons as they looked to see what approached. What approached was three men from the town. A little nervous and somewhat fearful, Lofto Kissin muttered quietly enough that only Analysts could hear. I bet they're coming here to ask us to move along because they'd had a bad experience with some other band. The whole band rose to their feet, which made the delegation from the town even more nervous. There was some stuttering and stammering. Then one of them finally spoke. Sire, we have come to you with a proposition which we think you might find beneficial. The spokesman seemed to hope that he could awe them with his knowledge of fancy words. Jakath was spokesman for the band by mutual consent. Speak on, sir. A little more encouraged, the spokesman for the town continued. There is a group of bandits in the neighborhood. We would like to hire you to rid us of them. We're not certain, but no more than 5 or 6. And if we should accept your commission, what terms do you offer? We had thought to offer you a gold piece for every bandit you brought in. Analyst's heart leapt. Analyst's heart leaped. 5 bandits at 1 gold each, and 20 silver pieces to a gold. Jakath shook his head. And what would we eat while we were scouring the hills for these bandits? No, a simple bounty is not enough. Pay us 5 silver pieces a week for living expenses, plus a bounty for whatever bandits we bring in. But the townsman had not allowed himself to be completely overawed by the adventurers. Living expenses? So you wander the hills for a couple of weeks, living on our food, never taking a risk, then in the end you simply say you couldn't find them? And you were on your way laughing at us? No, we could not do that. Suppose we you contract to stay in the area for 4 weeks or until the bandits are dealt with, and we will pay your expenses for the first week. Jakath shook his head and made a counter proposal. Nanla suddenly considered the possibility that, though they might be hired to fight the bandits, not all of them might survive the experience. But he'd done well enough in the fight against bandits that when he and Jakath had been out alone. Nor he'd been incompetent when it came to fighting the goblins. Unless the bandits were much more better fighters than he thought likely, this group ought to do well against them. But there was always the possibility of a lucky hit. By this time, Jakath and the townsmen had come to an arrangement. The band would attempt to track bandits for 3 weeks, or until the bandits were found. The town would pay for their supplies for the first 2 weeks, nonetheless knowing what they'd find in the way of funds. Hoped they found the bandits within the first 2 weeks. The townspeople had a few guesses as to the general area where they should look for the bandits, given the stretch of road they tended to favor and the usual direction of their tracks after a raid. Even analysts knew that this was no guarantee that they actually lived in the particular area. But the general truth about the bandits was that they were lazy and preferred a slightly risky life of robbing people on highways to doing honest work. That being so, if they could find a fresh enough trail, the half elf ought to be able to follow it, no matter how they tried to hide their tracks. They'd had a good night's rest, then went into the town in the morning for their supplies, and a last chat about the bandits. For instance, did anyone in the town know any of the bandits? Or had any of them come into the town to buy supplies? The spokesman for the town, a man named Carthaven, was indignant at the thought of anyone from the village becoming a bandit or selling anything to bandits. Jakath pointed out to him that the villager would have some advantages, such as knowing the woods and the trails around for some distance around. As for coming in to buy supplies, who could say that some roughly dressed individual was a bandit or merely a traveler? They would have they would have the good sense not to try to sell jewelry or other stolen goods to a small town. But there was nothing about a silver coin to say whether it had been stolen or merely given for services rendered. Having matters explained in this way, Carthaven nodded, then proceeded to describe several people who had come to the town from time to time, who he had thought might be bandits. These included at least one man who matched a description given by a traveler who had been robbed on the road. With all this knowledge and full packs, the band set out. As they went, Jakath explained a few things for Analys's benefit. It would be easier if we could travel the road until we came on a place where bandits have just attacked, then follow their tracks. But that depends on so much on chance because no no like they're not likely to be out every day or even necessarily every week. What we'll do is go to the last place where they were reported and see if we can come on anything there. It's occurred to me, Anna said, that the town is taking some risk. Suppose we were the type to do so. We could go out, kill the first 5 passers-by, go in, claim there are bandits, collect our reward, and be on the way. Jakath smiled slightly. I'm sure they had that in their minds too, but it would be difficult to find 5 passers-by who weren't by someone, perhaps even someone with enough influence to start an investigation. So when they come to Intilis and find that a person of that description was turned in as a dead bandit, they would start looking for us. And then it could be even worse. One of the passers-by could be someone who is well known to the townspeople themselves. The hunt for us would be on before even sooner. No, I don't think we'll try to pull that one on them. Analysts had not thought of the possibility of a passerby known to townsfolk, nodded in embarrassment. As it turned out, when they went to inspect the area of last known bandit attack, they found some traces of a trail leading off to the northwest, toward the hills. For the first little while, the bandits had been concerned only to get themselves away from the highway. But after that, they began to try to hide their trail. Even then, Jakath or Orpha could find enough signs to lead them further to the northwest. Then the bandits began to take some pains to travel with as little sign of their passage as possible. Twice they entered streams. Several times they went across hard-packed ground that would not take a track. At this point, left O'Keeson for the tracking, spotting traces that no one else could see. Sometimes even when he pointed them out, they went on. The bandits knew what their goal was and could travel much faster, particularly as they were on horseback, especially so when the party had to cast about for sign had to cast about for signs of their tracks from time to time. They camped in the wood, keeping watch, not only against bandits, but against whatever else other creatures might wander these uplands. About noon of the next day, Lafto Kissen shook his head and said, "Lost them. Well, with a trail this old, I doubt we have much of a chance of picking it up again." "You're sure?" asked Jakath. "Fairly sure. I can spend a little more time looking around, but I don't think it's worth it." Jakath nodded. "I suppose the best thing to do is to go back up the road and see if we can pick up the trail again. If we can. The bandits aren't going to do a robbery once a day or maybe even once a week. We may spend the rest our time waiting for a chance to find a trail. Then do you think we should spend a week or so tramping around these woods hoping to find something?" "Maybe not the whole week, but at least a day or two. I mean, think about it. They were headed in this direction, and sure they'd want to hide some distance off of the road, but they wouldn't want to hide so far off the road that it took them a week to get to town for supplies. I'd say we're pretty clear by luck if we do a bit of looking around. And if we don't find anything right away, then we can go back to the town and start over again." Jakath thought it over for a bit, and then nodded. "You're right there. We ought to do a little looking around before we quit. The next thing to do is to decide which direction we do our looking round in." Lafto Kissen shook his head. "In this kind of country, we might walk past within spitting distance of them and not notice them. But if everyone else agrees, I'll go along." Anlis, who was feeling a little hot and tired, thought it within himself that it was a waste to go back to the road without at least looking around a little. But he also believed the half elf when he spoke of the unlikelihood of finding anything in this brush. So he kept quiet until the others had spoken, by which time Jakath and Nalis Tador had come out moderately in favor of having a short look around, which rendered Annalis's vote moot. Lafto Kissen was right. They tramped around in the brush for much of the afternoon, but found no sign of bandits. At last they gave it up and headed back to the road. Even though they were traveling a little faster on this journey, not having to try to follow almost invisible tracks, they still ended up sleeping in another night in the wilds. The next day, a little before noon, they came back to the town. Carthaban was a little surprised to see them, and was definitely annoyed when he discovered that the closest they'd come to the bandits was to follow an old trail until it petered out. "We made an agreement, and we won't be changing it or adjusting the terms in the middle of things. That's what you're hoping for." Chikath shook his head. "No, that wasn't the point at all. It was merely that we could spend a time thrashing about in the brush, purple trail, with better, unless, of course, there is someone in the village who knows a little more precisely where these bandits have their hideout." Girthavan bridled at the thought. Someone in the village being in so close league with the bandits? Impossible! Then he calmed himself. "Well, I don't necessarily know every thought in every mind of the village, and there are one or two who might just..." Chikath broke in. "Actually, it's best not to pressure anyone too much. We don't want the bandits to take warning and just sit in there, no, you can trust, and ask if they've ever heard anything to suggest just where the bandits are. As for us, we'll take a little rest, then go down to the road again and see if we can find anything further. I expect your own business best, but don't be hanging around the village too long, or the rest of them will be pestering me about you wasting their money. And we'll have to come to you and have this talk all over again. Jacath nodded. That's part of the reason why we came to tell you what we were up to. Don't worry. If you remember the terms of the agreement, we give you 1 free week of searching if we don't find them in the first 2 weeks. And you don't want us to waste your money. Neither do we want to be wasting our own. But Orphaz was right about the bandits, for they did not strike that day, nor the next. But the day after that, Annalise was becoming a little fidgety about the whole thing, wondering if perhaps the bandits did not have a confederate among the townsfolk who had warned them to lie low for the next little while. But as they were walking the road that afternoon, they came upon a place where the bandits had attacked. There were 3 dead women and 2 dead men, all the corpses stripped, and the flies were thick. This is what they had waited for. They set off into the brush again. As they walked, Annalise felt a nagging guilt. 5 dead people was good fortune for Jacath's band, for they could proceed to track the bandits. But it was very bad luck for the people who had been killed. Shouldn't they feel a little bad for the fact that someone else's bad luck was their good luck? He eventually convinced himself to stop worrying. It would be worse if they didn't find the bandits, and if they did, then they could consider the 5 dead to be avenged, not to mention preventing the same thing from happening again, at least until another band of lawless men found their way into this territory. This time they moved faster, for even when the bandits hid their trail, Lafto-Kissin was able to spot traces easier. And though toward the end the robbers took extreme caution, the adventurers never lost a trail. That is to say, the bandits had hidden their trail as well as they ever did, but the traces they left were fresher, and the half-elf was able to spot them much easier. Finally, Lafto-Kissin held up a hand. We're coming very close now. We'll have to move quietly. Annalise, who already thought he was moving quietly, wasn't sure what more he could do. He tried to make even less noise, and he must have been successful because nobody complained to him about it. A very short time later, Lafto-Kissin held up his hand once more. We're there, he whispered. Annalise could see nothing but bushes and trees, but before he made a fool of himself by asking questions, he caught a slight scent of horses. The breeze shifted slightly, and the scent became stronger. They all looked at Jacath, who nodded, then jerked his head back the way they had come. Excuse me. After moving about a bow shot away from where they'd been, they stopped. Well, we could do several things from here. For instance, we could move up to where we were, then charge right in and hope that surprise would do the trick. Or we could wait until tonight when it'd be easier to surprise them. But if we wait, we're taking the chance that one of them might go off hunting for just a walk and stumble on us by accident. Annalise spoke up. I may be a fool for admitting this, but I saw no sign of them. I did get a good whiff of their horses, though. So if we're making tactical plans, I don't think I'd be much use. The others grinned good-humoredly. As far as tactical plans are concerned, Jacath said, what we'll probably be doing is slipping up to where we were before, then maybe spreading out a little to give us all room, then charging out and yelling like mad while we try and kill them before they get to their weapons. I imagine we'll all see more than we want to of bandits and robbers before this is through. Nahlas Tedor shook his head. I'm a bit tired from dragging through this brush all day. I'd prefer to have a bit of a rest before we make our charge. But we can't ignore the possibility that one of the thieves has a little magical ability and might be able to notice our presence. And then, nighttime. Oh no, that doesn't make sense at all. Hold on. There we go. Him, him, him. The nighttime gives the possibility of friends fighting friends by accident. On balance, I'd say we should attack now. Orphaz scowled. Do it now and get it over with. Nighttime's bad for fighting, unless the wizard has a light spell with him to give us light for fighting. Nalus Tador shook his head. Spells like that are usually require the wizard to be doing little else but holding the spell. That means I'd be out of this fight. I know some wizards who can hold a minor light while they're doing other things, but that's not me. We don't know anything about these bandits, what kind of fighters they may be, so I don't think we want to back out of on our fighting numbers like that. Jakath was nodding while the magician spoke. Right. We attack now. Let's get into position. When we get back up there, he gestured in the direction of the bandits. Anlis, you hold still. Orphaz, you and Nalus Tedor go off to the right. Lofto-Kissin and I will go off to the left. When we're in position, I'll give a whistle, we'll all jump out and head for them. With any luck, we can kill a couple before they get the out. And noticed he had been asked for his views on whether they should attack now or later. But since he hadn't really seen any bandits and he knew how inexperienced he was, it didn't bother him very much. They headed back up along the way they'd come, and finally reached the spot where they'd stopped previously. This time, the half-elf seemed to disappear off the side of the trail, and Jakath followed him nearly soundlessly. Then, Nalus Tador and Orphaz went off the other way, and Anna stepped into the place where Lofto-Kissin had been standing where he stopped them. This time, peering through the willows, he could actually see the bandit camp. What he could see was a single jerry-built shack, leaning a little to one side. As he watched, a small whiff of smoke came out of the chimney. Lounging around the cabin, in various poses, were 5 ragged, bearded men. They didn't look particularly dangerous, but they did look vicious. It suddenly occurred to him that his sword was still in its sheath. Very carefully, as soundlessly as possible, he drew the blade. Then he waited for the signal. Suddenly it came and he jerked in response. Then he went round to the willows, raising his sword and yelling as he came. He noticed the others on the right and on his left, but he paid little attention to them. Fixing his eyes on the bandit he had chosen as his first target, the little man had been sitting on a stump, mending something. At the sound of Jakath's whistle, he leapt to his feet, his hand going immediately to his sword. By the time the analyst had stepped into the clearing, his sword was out and he was looking right and left, assessing the situation. Then he headed for Analyst. The bandit brought his sword up over his head, preparatory to a vicious downward slash. Analyst brought up his own sword to ward it off, then slashed in return. Somehow the bandit parried the blow, and the two of them were fencing. Analyst did everything by instinct, using the moves that had been trained to his arms by his early sword training and by the regular practice he had been having for the last weeks. Suddenly, the bandit staggered backward, gashed across the chest. As the man fell, Analyst stepped forward, the bandit crumpling to the ground, but Analyst was remembering the warnings he'd been given about people feigning death and coming back alive at the most inopportune moment. Even as the man fell, he thrust his sword into him, then jerked it free. There! If he was feigning death, he had more reason to feign now. Analyst turned to his right to see Orphaz fencing with another man, a taller and lankier sort. He noticed a trace of blood on Orphaz's sleeve and moved in to help. As he moved, it was as if he'd heard Jakath's rough voice in his ear. When it comes to Malay boy, forget everything you've ever heard about fighting fair. Hit him from behind or from the side. It doesn't matter. Just make sure you hit him good. He swung back a backhand blow into the robber's chest, sorry, in the robber's waist, and watched him crumple. Then Orpaz thrust his own sword into him and stepped back half a step, grinning at grinned at Annalise, then looked around for someone else to fight. Annalise looked around as well, but the others were finished their fight, standing over bandit corpses and looking around themselves. Check the house, said Chakath. We know about 5 of them, but there may be others nobody knows about. They approached the shack with caution, and Lafto Kissin stood a little to one side of the door, then kicked it open with a wheeling sort of kick. The half elf paused a moment, then jumped through the open door. A moment later, he called out to them, Nobody in here! 5 beds! So I think we got them all. The band went inside to see just what kind of treasure was to be had in the bandit's lair. Sorry, I really need my coffee. Chapter 12. Chakath. He hadn't expected to find the bandit's hideout. But even so, Chakath was disappointed in how poor the pickings were. They found 32 silver ponies, and another 14 ponies worth of copper coins, along with a bit of jewelry, which, as far as Chakath could make out, was about 20 silver ponies, maybe less depending on where they had to sell it, where they had to sell it. As for weapons and armor, well, the weapons were average quality, perhaps worth taking to the market, but likely not. The armor was boiled leather, which wasn't worth hauling out. He considered the horses, since these were bandits, horses were probably also stolen, so it wouldn't do to be riding stolen horses when you might run into the relatives of the previous owners. Turn them loose to fend for themselves, or lead them back to the village and hope to sell them there? He shook his head. Best to turn them loose and let them go. At least with the money they would get from the bounty. Something about the situation bothered him, but he couldn't quite place it. He shook his head. Let's share out this lot and see how they came out. He explained his thinking regarding the horses, armor, and swords to the others, and they all seemed to be willing to accept his reasoning. Alice seemed a little doubtful, but when he saw the others went along, he did as well. The boy wasn't totally stupid anyway. If he was willing to watch and learn from the more experienced men, then it was a good indication of the way he would work out. Lofto-Kissin spoke up. We could look around a bit. It's possible they've got more hidden away, somewhere away from the house. Yes, we ought to do that. But from the looks of them, I'd say that any time they got a little ahead, they went into some town or other and got roaring drunk, threw money around like it was water, and went back to this little place practically dead broke. They spent a while looking around, but if there was another hiding place for money, the robbers had hidden it very well. The adventurers sat down to share out their spoils. Given the paltry nature of the spoils, they decided to take along the swords. They may well have been stolen, but none of them had any special marks on them. In a case like that, it would be very difficult to try and prove that they were stolen goods, unlike the matter of the horses. And a few other silver pieces each would not go amiss. Among the jewelry, there was a strange looking ring, apparently of silver, with a face of some kind of beast on it. Alice seemed to take a liking to it, and asked if they would allow him to split some of his share in to have that ring. The others were agreeable, and so it was arranged. Jacath became a bit uneasy. Now, Alice, would you have a look at that ring and see if it has some sort of spell on it? The magician turned the ring over in his hands, peered at it closely, sat with the ring in one fist, his eyes closed in concentration. Finally, he shook his head. There is magic in it, all right, but it isn't cursed if that's what worries you. From the feel of it and from the look of it, it's a low order magic giving control over wild animals. The only problem is you have to know the appropriate words to make it work. Without them, it's only a moderately interesting piece of jewelry. Could somebody find out what the words were? Asked Annalise. Natus Tedor grimaced. Perhaps, but the words for these kinds of things are often not self-evident, and you might spend 20 years looking at the end of it only to be able to control black beetles or something like that. Can't be that good a magic if the bandits took it from its owner, murmured Urfraz absently, fingering the bandage on his arm. Even a powerful magician can get cut down from an ambush before he knows there's danger, answered Nahus Tedor. So, if nobody disagrees, let Annalise have it, said Jacath. But don't expect us all to be stopping and waiting while you ask every magician and wise man if he knows anything about words to control it. Now, I'd suggest we get ourselves ready. We can get a good part of the way back to Entelis before dark. Nobody objected to that. They hacked off the bandits' heads, wrapped them up securely, and each slung one at his belt. The next day, they came back to Entelis, and Carthavan gave them a sideward glance. What is it this time? More supplies? Not at all, said Jacath jovially. We've removed your bandit problem, for the time being. Removed it? 5 dead bandits. We've brought in their heads. And I'd say we removed the problem temporarily because it won't be too long before some of their bandits move into the territory. But you'll be free of them at least for a while. 5 dead bandits? Carthavan seemed a little confused. Yes, indeed. Correct. So yes, 5 dead bandits. That was what the contract called for. Am I not correct? Ah, the contract. Yes. Well, I have to talk to the other leaders of the town before we give you your payment. Excuse me. He hurried out. Jacath looked around at the rest of the band. I have a bad feeling about this, he said. You think they don't intend to pay us? Asked Orphaz. No, I wouldn't say that. They wouldn't be insane enough to hire us without payment, without money at all. I think we're going to be asked to take a short payment. What's our alternatives? What's our alternative? Asked Nahus Tedor with a smile. You want me to get a curse ready to put on them, or do you think they may try to mob us under to avoid paying anything? And what happens when they help from their bandager? Short paying is one thing, but murder is another. Keep alert just in case. Suddenly, the wrong feeling he had had in the hills came clear to him. 5 gold pieces was a lot of money for a village like this. They were going to be asked to take a short payment because the villagers had not thought they could kill all 5 bandits and had been expecting to pay maybe 2 or 3 gold pieces worth. The problem is, what should the band do? Or what could they do? Now let's get some sort of spell ready. Something that looks impressive, like you're holding lightning in check or something. You think we're in trouble then? Asked the Rahasonite. I'm pretty sure they're going to short pay us, since a village like this would have had a hard time getting 5 gold pieces together. But they might get a but they might get a crowd together in case we object, and in a situation like that, it would be easy for things to get out of hand. So get ready, all right? Nautilus, now, Nihilus Tedor nodded and set to work. Shortly thereafter, villagers began to gather around the party. Jakath had made sure the party were so placed that their rear was protected by the wall without a top. Despite all the people gathering, he was fairly sure this was merely a gathering of forces to try to prevent the venturers from doing or threatening anything rash, but he wasn't taking any chances. The villagers formed a rough half circle around them, most of them eyeing Nalus Tador, who had small flickers of blue flame running up and down his arms. Finally, Kurzavin appeared, along with two who had originally approached them. Why the crowd, Kurzavin? Asked Jakath. Uh, all we want to express our all we want is to express our gratitude to the people who have freed us from the ravages of the bandits. I hope this is going to include some gold. Well, yes, about that. There's a problem, you see. A problem? He wasn't about to help them out with this. Yes, you see, we had expected you to kill one or two of them, drive the others off. We had not expected you to kill the lot of them. Are you leading up to telling us that you don't intend to pay us? Well, not exactly, but you must admit we've had we have been generous about your supplies, which were included in our agreement. So you're saying that you made an agreement which you never intended to fulfill? No, not that. It's just that we never thought you'd be so thorough about the task. And the truth is, there are not 5 gold pieces in this whole town. I see. And I suppose you have a proposal for us? Well, yes. We propose to pay you the equivalent of 3 gold pieces, hoping that you will understand our position. And I hope that you will understand our position. We contracted for 1 gold piece per bandit, and if we allow everyone to change their contract as suits them, why, soon we'll be working for nothing at all, and we can hardly afford that. But I've told you the gold is not available. So you have told me, and I do not doubt your word. Our intention of paying it in full. There was a mutter from the gathered villagers this time. What we will accept is this. You pay us the 3 gold pieces that you have, and gather the rest of the money. When we pass this way again, you will pay at that time. Carthalvin frowned. I beg your pardon, sir, but pay it to whom? As I understand it, parties of venturers shift and change. A person dropping out here has a here, a person added in there, and if your people comes back with a different group of companions, should we be expected to pay the same 2 gold pieces 5 times? Jakath nodded. All right then. Suppose we make it that you pay. For how long do we hold this money? Jakath thought about that for a moment. 5 years, he said. If we haven't come back in 5 years, you can take the money and have a festival in our honor. Agreed. Everyone, villagers and venturers, relaxed a little. Carthavin took out a small pouch. Here is your money, he said, as though he were handing over some great quantity of treasure. Jakath looked at the pouch, then accepted it. He looked at Carthavin. Very full for 3 gold pieces, for 3 pieces of gold, he said. Do you think there'd be even 1 piece of gold in a town this size? We made up the worth in coins of various sizes. If you'll permit, I'll just count this before we go. Carthapan was about to say something regarding the lack of trust when he remembered what the original bargain that the original bargain ought to have been called for 5 gold pieces. So he merely frowned and nodded. Jakath emptied the bag and sorted through it. The bag contained 41 silver coins, most of them silver ponies of Eridar, but there were a few Shandakiranian coins, even this far from the border. The rest was in copper, 380 of them, of various mintings. Jacath noted that several of the coins were worn and clipped, making them possibly less valuable. He considered for a moment complaining about that, but then decided the situation was a bit too touchy for that. He would have to take what they would have to take what they could get, and make a note to see the money the first see the money first next time they got involved in one of these things. Shortly after that, they were back on the road again. I noticed, Jacath, that the rest of the money is to be paid to you. I suppose this means that we have to stay together and look after you carefully if we want to see any of it. Lofto Kissin sounded a little bitter. I suppose you could look at it that way. I was just interested in getting us out of there with whole skins. You may have noticed that the people were getting restless toward the end there. I suppose that you could look at it another way. You can try to make sure that when I die, I have more than 2 gold pieces on me. You can share that out and not have to worry about coming back to Intellis. The half elf muttered something under his breath, but Jacath didn't ask him to repeat it. There were other things on his mind, such as getting somewhere down the road and replenishing their supplies. He talked to the others that night around their campfire. We're headed down the road to Yathauer. We can see about selling these swords there, which imagine will give us enough to live on for a little while longer. My idea is that we hire out as caravan guards there, but if anyone has a better idea, let's hear it. Nobody gets rich as caravan guards, but at least we'll eat regularly, said Loftokisson. What I'd suggest is we hang around the taverns for a while, see if we can pick up any interesting rumors. Then we check into the caravan business. I'd say the half elf's right, said Orphaz, scratching his wounded arm again. We get to eat as caravan guards, but uh, roughly it's really rough to get ahead unless you manage to work yourself some sort of graft, some sort of graft. I think you meant grift, and that's taking quite a risk. If you can get a half decent price for these swords, we can afford to sit around for a few days to pick up on any rumors. Analyst spoke up then. What about those swords? I don't know much. Sword is usually several pieces. But you've all been talking as though we'd be lucky to get a couple of copper pieces for these ones. Ha! The joys of youth and naivety, said Lafto Kirsten sarcastically. He looked around at the others. Should I explain the facts of life to him? When nobody objected, he turned back to Annalise. Yes, indeed. A good sword can be worth several gold pieces. These, however, are not good quality. They, they weren't good quality in the first place. Bashed together by someone with a small knowledge of smithing. That cuts back on their value. Then they're also old and have some hard use. We can have them up before we sell them, but still, we'd have to get a really good market, say at a time when somebody is arming a small army and the sword market is up. Fact is, we'll probably be lucky to be able to sell them as scrap metal, maybe 30 silver pieces each. Jacath broke in then. All right, then, that's enough. Analyst is young, but he's learning, and there's no point in beating him over the head with how much more he has to learn. He's right too, half elf. We'll be lucky to be eating money out of these blades, but we'll certainly do our best out of them. And I think general consensus is that we should take some time to listen around the taverns before we make a definite decision as to what else to do. He looked at Nellis Tedor, who had remained silent throughout the discussion. You haven't said anything, Nellis. Do you have any suggestions? The magician roused himself. There's always the lizard people. Everyone looked at him. The barony of Perindu, Hassan, is continually in the need of people to fight against the lizard folk. Usually, they'd always been content to live in their little settlements and not bother anyone. But in the last 10 years, they've taken up raiding human villages and setting up new settlements. As you can guess, this raiding and expanding is taking away the revenue and potential revenue from the Lord of Ginduf. So he's taken to hiring whoever will come and fight the lizard folk for him. Jakath shook his head. We don't want to be a part of anyone's party, I think. Oh, no, no armies? So, oh, no, no armies. He just hires bands like ours, sends out an overseer to see to it that they do what they're supposed to do and keep tallies of what they achieve and pays them accordingly. If you get a bad overseer, you might have to grease his writing hand a little to make sure he lists your achievements properly. But that's about all. Oh, and some of them can be as about touchy as their rank as the Chandrakranians. But other than that, the situation can be as profitable as running around looking for giants or ogres or goblins with hidden treasure. Jakath rubbed his chin. I've heard a little about this business of the lizard men, but most of the people I've heard talking were a little soaked in beer at the time. First, but we should keep it in mind. What do the rest of you think of that? Better than starving, was Lafto Kissen's succinct reply. I think I'd be careful about people who can match the Chandrakaranians for rank consciousness, said Orphaz. Otherwise, the idea seems sound enough. You get in with the wrong bunch of Chandrakranian nobles, and anything you do or don't do can be the death of you. You know, we all know your feelings about Chandrakranian nobles, Jath broke in. What concern here is for Hassan, and I understand you have expressed qualified support. Analyst, what about you? Analyst looked up, almost surprised that anyone had asked his opinion, but said, I don't mind the idea of going to Rahasan, but we're going to have to make sure we have the funds to support ourselves on the way, not to mention paying passage by boat. But already talked about that. That being decided, they took to their beds. The rest of the trip to Yathauer was pretty much uneventful. Again, from time to time, they saw bands of goblins off in the distance, but they were never attacked. The bandits, seeing a group of armed adventurers, would probably leave them alone because the risk of attacking them wasn't worth the little they might be carrying. Nor were they approached by anyone else along the route to fight off the bandits, goblins, or anything else. Jakath was a little glad of that, since he wasn't sure he could convince the band to take on that sort of job, having just been badly burned. They arrived at Yath about the middle of the day, so one of the first things they did was to try to sell the swords. The market was slow, however, and the first three merchants they approached wouldn't even make them an offer on their swords. The fourth offered to pay them 80 silver pieces for the lot, though he said that he was only buying them to be reforged into something useful. After a bit of bargaining, during which they couldn't get him to shift his position even a little, they took the money. They then went looking for taverns. In a city the size of Yathauer, venturers could be found in practically every tavern, though there were usually certain ones where the crowd is made up of exclusively adventurers. And the way things always went, That was a certain crowd of adventurers would, at some time, become tired of a certain place or decide that they were not being properly treated in another place and would go off to find a different place. Oh boy. After a certain time, the new place had become a place for adventurers to come, and the old place would have nothing but a few too set in their ways to move. Yeah, that's something that has to be rewritten. It's fine. Like I said, this is a very rough draft. And I'm sure it doesn't. If I were to read it, it probably doesn't visually read the way it reads when I talk. After trying 3 places, Jacat's party finally came to one calling itself the Dancing Rooster. They went inside and saw that the customers in that place were a rough and rugged looking lot. Many were armed, some were not armed visibly. This looks like a pleasant crew, said Lafto Kissin. Oh, I don't know, said Orphaz. I don't think any of them would cut your throat unless there was something in it for them. So let's not look too rich and watch each other's backs, said Nalas Tedor. Tran and Viren, snorted Chakath. What a bunch of sissies. I've been in worse places than this, and sometimes unarmed too. Come on. They went in and took a table. When the pot girl came around, they ordered beer, and some spent some time watching. Have a look around, Chakath told the party. See if you see anyone you know. Without being too obvious about it, they looked around the crowd. If worse came to worse, they could pick some likely looking individual and attempt to up a conversation with them. As far as Chakath could see, he recognized none of the people at present by name, though there were several he had seen elsewhere. Nor were there any of the people present the sort of people he would approach if he had any in the matter. He kept looking around obtrusively for the length of time it took to have a mug of beer served and drunk without haste. He looked at his fellows. Anything? He asked. Nellis Tedder shook his head. Lafto Kissin said, Nobody I know to talk to. Orphaz shook his head too. The only people I see are a couple of fellows I once had words with regarding Shandakrani and aristocracy. And if they remember the discussion the way I do, they won't want to talk to me either. So we try somewhere else? I suppose. They got up, paid their shot, and trooped out. Okay. That's all. Yeah, so I'm gonna try and skip to because I have a copy of the synopsis, but I don't think they even. Oh, wait. Okay, so there's a little bit more that goes on in this story. But even so, it's only just like a little bit further than than the rest, basically. But this isn't even necessarily the way, normally the final synopsis follows the story exactly. This one is like the rough idea written before the final story. It just talks about them going after lizard men. And someone's looking for them. Yeah, and then it just has it it kind of just trails off. So I need to take some time and write the rest of it. I can make it good. I have some ideas already on how this is gonna go. Thoughts within thoughts. Anyway, yeah, I really appreciate everyone who, like, took the time to listen. Um, yeah, if this is your first time and you're popped into the middle of it's the end of the story, just feel free to go back to the first parts of the broadcast. I try and group them with the names of the story. Yeah, so yeah, like I said again, I really appreciate everyone who stopped by to who's been like watching past broadcasts, that sort of thing. People who've subscribed, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. As soon as I have an idea, I'm probably gonna be starting up again next month. What it is, and this is where I'm gonna do this. I was gonna do it to my, was going to do it to my newsletter first, but you guys, everyone who's like subscribed, and possibly my newsletter subscribed, so I hope so. But anyway, this is the original story. This will be this will be going live. Um, in certain places at the end of this month, and then at the rest of the places at the end of April. So this is what I've been working on. This is what I'm continuing to work on. This is this came well. I don't know if it came before, but it's finished. And for 40 silver ponies, it's supposed to be like the same world as you can tell. Oh, I read the because I read this last month. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will talk to you guys the beginning of April. I'll probably like pop in and say hi to everyone and do some like updates here and there. But for the most part, I am off while I'm trying to get that out the door. So yeah, um, it'll be nice to have everyone's feedback. Don't forget to like and subscribe where applicable. Yeah, again, you guys really warm my heart, and I will talk to you in April. For really real, good night, everybody.